I recently saw that billboard in the San Fernando Valley. It had the classic image of Lincoln and the words failed, failed, failed. And it looked like it had been defaced with graffiti, but that might have been part of the billboard. And no author or artist or organization or sponsor is credited. But I thought, wow, what a provocative question. When you look at our country today, the divisiveness and hate and the deep-rooted, lingering racism, which is a holdover from the founding of our country, but which we fought our bloodiest domestic war over, when we look at a prison labor population made up of a disproportionately large percentage of young black men, a country where the black man, woman, and child are at such a lethal disadvantage medically, economically, educationally, where abject, hopeless, inescapable poverty and its consequences still reigns, and white supremacy and its consequences, though abhorrent, repulsive, and repugnant to the majority of Americans, still rules this country, one must ask on this Juneteenth, did Lincoln fail? Is Lincoln our first national martyr? Or is that just some more anti-critical race theory, anti-historical nonsense? It's like when I hear people say Jesus died for our sins, but we all know there's still sin. More sin than ever. So Jesus died for nothing? It's the same with Lincoln. Lincoln was murdered for our racism. He was sacrificed to make this a more perfect union. But it's a far more imperfect union than ever. Not that it ever was that good to begin with. Then there's Lincoln the myth versus Lincoln the reality. And as we look deeper into American history, we see how much mythologizing clouds the accurate retelling of America's story. How these myths are so far removed, sometimes barely remotely connected to any version of the truth. So Lincoln wasn't some shucks guy, some country bumpkin. Hey man, look, I'm president. I walked 5 miles to school and rode on the back of a shovel. Lincoln was a smart, ambitious man who craved and desired power like all presidents, who had an ego and narcissism and arrogance and delusion and sociopathy amongst his traits like all presidents do. And let's dare ask the big question. And this question has loomed over the crossroads of American history. Did Lincoln even free the slaves? No, that was just hype. The Civil War was first and foremost a battle over which paradigm America should follow. The Southern feudal agrarian culture fueled by slave labor, or the newly developed industrial culture of the North, which also had slaves and slave labor and relied on the slave labor of the South as well. But the value of black people and the fate of slaves and slavery was only an adjunct issue to the larger economic issue. Remember, the biggest bargain in capitalism is slave labor. Capitalism needs slavery of one kind or another to function, succeed, and profit. So today, perhaps people don't work for free, but they work for nothing, because even if they're paid, it's not nearly enough to live independently, even though your boss may be a billionaire who's raking in record profits on your labor. And this isn't just China or Russia or North Korea or Southeast Asia. This is America's reality as well. We are all using prisoners and children and minorities and migrants to provide essential goods and services for all of us, for virtually nothing. Ask someone trying to get by on the minimum wage. It's too controversial to call it slavery, so let's call it virtual slavery, but it is what it is. And when the workers here become too expensive, we find even cheaper labor in countries where slavery, servitude of one kind or another are rampant. Here in America, back in our first centuries of existence, neither the North or the South, for the most part, even considered black people fully human in relation to white people. And sadly, to jump ahead to the present, We all know of people who still believe this. A lot of people. But now, this racism and distorted belief system isn't just in the South, it's everywhere. Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation under the guise of saving the Union. But in reality, the agenda was to save capitalism and to ensure that going forward into the future, America would be an industrial capitalist society. The old ways of the South stood in the way. It was an inefficient system, and slavery was part of that. If that old agrarian feudal system was to be destroyed, the institution of slavery must be destroyed with it. For many reasons. And yes, human rights was one, but only one reason, and not the primary reason. Here's a quote from Abraham Lincoln's first inaugural address to Congress in 1861. Quote, "I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so." By the way, that's a great Lincoln impression, trust me. It was also calculated that freeing the slaves would guarantee that those newly liberated, super fucking angry ex-slaves would join the Union Army, which they did. And these newly freed slaves did that with the express purpose, the fierce determination to fight for and protect their rights as humans and as citizens. Little did they know their descendants would still be fighting to gain those rights and even losing some almost 200 years later. Military and political considerations, the fate of capitalism, sheer shameless opportunism, these were the forces driving Lincoln's decisions. And I'm not suggesting he had no qualms or doubts about the enslavement of other humans or a belief that all humans should be free. But all of our early leaders espoused that, while they owned and beat and raped their slaves. And though it's true, Lincoln didn't own slaves, he was in no rush to end slavery. And yes, while it's also true, he did actually come from humble beginnings. Once he was president, he had the 19th century so-called progressive version of slavery, black servants. So Lincoln as a human may have found slavery to be a moral crime, which he abhorred. But as a politician, his feelings were quite different. And that's in keeping with all America's leaders, even to this day, with certain obvious exceptions. Lincoln did not believe on a fundamental level that this country could ever work with or accept the integration of a free black population. Was he right? Is that true? You may point to progress. We've had a black president and a black vice president, both subject to and hamstrung by racist white supremacist majorities in the Congress and Senate and every other American institution, while being criticized for being ineffective and forced to absorb racist personal attacks like questioning their citizenship. So progress, such as it is, comes with a price, and that price is sometimes violent regression. We must point to the horrific, underreported cover-up of multitudes of dark, bloody episodes in American history, like the Tulsa Massacre, the Tuskegee Experiment, routine sterilizations of black female inmates, violent segregation in every segment of society, from education to politics to culture to professional sports. Jim Crow laws, sundown towns, the infiltration and destruction of any and all black movements by the government, the FBI, and COINTELPRO. The disproportionate arrests, conviction, and imprisonment of black men by a rigged system, making these men essentially political prisoners regardless of their crimes. Lynchings. The largest drug cartel in the world, the CIA, addicting America's poorest neighborhoods and destroying black communities. Man-made, fossil-fueled, big oil, big everything, climate disaster capitalism, decimating poor communities with apocalyptic weather and leaving more lives destroyed and people homeless without recourse. Emmett Till, George Floyd, the empty promises of the 13th Amendment, the unsolved murders of black leaders like Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and Huey Newton and Fred Hampton. Even if there are patsies rotting in jail, those crimes are unsolved, even though we all know who did it. And remember, the founding fathers who said all men are created equal made an exception for black people. They could legally be considered less than equal, and they could be owned. And with the weird exception of John Adams and John Quincy Adams, the founding fathers had slaves. Many of them, dozens, hundreds. So it starts right there. Look, obviously I'm not black, but that's part of the problem. We shouldn't need a Black History Month. This is our history. This is American history. See, this is critical race theory. This is what hasn't been taught to entire generations. But now, instead of hiding the truth, it's time we know it and acknowledge it as truth and teach the truth and not the lies in school. This ongoing battle is part of Lincoln's legacy, but also his prophecy. Instead of integration, which he never felt would work, he believed in reverse colonization. He wanted to send black people back to Africa. And part of Lincoln's original plan was to give reparations, but not to black people, not to the newly freed slaves. No, he intended to give reparations to slave owners for their loss of property, human property. Emancipation was a political strategy to tip the balance to the Union in the Civil War by accepting the influx of freed slaves escaping from the South and eager to fight for the North and destroy the racist South where they had been imprisoned for generations. Imagine that anger. Imagine that PTSD. Black people have been fighting a losing war against a racist monolith, our own government. That anger, that terror, that collective memory lingers too. And here's a little known fact about the Emancipation Proclamation. The proclamation itself actually freed very few slaves. The Emancipation Proclamation didn't apply to border slave states like Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri, all of which were loyal to the Union, yet still practiced slavery. We'll support the Union, but we're not giving up our slaves. Missouri at that time actually had two competing governments, one loyal to the Union and one still loyal to the Confederacy. Not that different than today. The Emancipation Proclamation also made exemptions for regions of the Confederacy that had already come under Union control in hopes of gaining the loyalty of white people in those states. Look, as long as you acknowledge that all men are created equal, you can keep your slaves. Shameless, manipulative, hypocritical, compromised politics once again winning out against any truly morally just agenda. And in the end, the Emancipation Proclamation didn't immediately free one single enslaved person, as the only places it applied were places where the federal government still had no control to enforce it, which was the Confederacy, who in 1863 the Union was still at war with and who would rather die than give up their way of life, which included the subjugation, torture, rape, and murder of slaves for profit. And further, although Lincoln never lived to see it, murdered by a white supremacist conspiracy, I might add, he had no plan for post-war Reconstruction or national unification. It wasn't like the South was just going to lose the war and say, okay, you won, whatever that means, and we will immediately change our ways. And it still hasn't. So, was Lincoln a failure? Did Lincoln fail? You could say he did. He believed that no matter what, America should remain a white man's country. And his actions freed very few slaves, but perpetuated the brutal racism that still goes on today. But the failure was also ours. White America had no appetite for freeing the slaves. The blood, the carnage, the economic cost, the division, and maybe most of all, and this is so true even today, the inconvenience. Change requires destruction and violence and expense. Change is a hassle. And for white people then, just like today, they are essentially okay with the status quo. Change is scary, and white America is still scared of black liberation. So, do we actually believe that all humans are created equal? Do we believe everyone deserves the same rights? Do we? Because if we do, then it doesn't matter whether Lincoln succeeded or failed. Our success as a country, as a concept, as an idea, is not up to Lincoln. It's up to us.